Welcome to our webinar. It's about the story of Winfield Scott Hancock and his wife Almira and Russell Hancock in Fort Myers, in the fort. You'll be able to see the other slides as I go along because I'm having a little problem with it sharing correctly, but you'll be able to see all the slides and get their story. And their story is going to come from Almira Hancock and what she published. And that's the only source we have about their time in Fort Myers. This was a book that was republished many years after the war. It's available online. You can download it for free. So let's check it out. General Winfield Scott Hancock was born on February 14, 1824 in Montgomeryville, Pennsylvania. He attended Norristown Academy briefly until a congressman nominated him to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He graduated 18th, and I have 25 students, but I think there were a few more than that, like 40 something, but he wasn't very high in the class ranking academically. And that kind of determined where you went in the military. The lower you did, the better chance you had of being in the infantry. Hancock was commissioned a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and he serves in the Mexican War under his namesake, General Winfield Scott, and he was the head of the armies at the beginning of the war. He was in the War of 1812. He was in the Mexican-American War, and I think his nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers. He was honored for his bravery at the Battle of Churubusco, I think I said that wrong, where he was wounded. And Hancock spent the next 2 years serving in Indian Territory as a recruiting officer. We're just going through his background to get to his time in Fort Myers. Well, you'll be able to hear Mrs. Hancock's words. This happens to be a picture of a much younger drawing of much younger Winfield Scott Hancock and his son Russell. Their only son, Russell, was born in 1850 and died in Mississippi on December 30th, 1884. And you will be able to see all the heartache that the Hancocks went through over their life. He was recognized for his leadership abilities, and he serves in a couple of administrative posts in Minnesota, Missouri, and he's in St. Louis, and he meets Almira Russell, the daughter of a successful merchant, and they're married and go on to have 2 children. I promise we'll be coming to the part about Fort Myers because that's what made me want to talk about this. But let's go here. Just to tell you a little bit, he's going to be sent there during what was then known as the Third Seminole War. And I'm not going to go into the causes of the war, but I just want you to read the back of this book. The root causes of the wars were the same ones that are behind most conflicts: intolerance, fear, and greed. So it was mainly fought over land conflicts, and it was a bunch of skirmishes that last from 1855 until 1858. The war was also known as Billy Bowlegs War because he was the main Seminole leader. And by the conclusion of the war, he had agreed to emigrate and take most of those remaining with them. But a small band of Seminoles under Sam Jones never left Florida, hid in Big Cypress Swamp, that's near the Everglades, and approximately 3,500 Seminoles who are in Florida today are descendants of those, as well as a few families who found their way back from the West. And here we have Winfield Scott Hancock. And this is from Mrs. Hancock's book when it was published. I just cropped the picture. So here he is as a young lieutenant. In February of 1856, he had an order from the adjutant general to proceed out without delay to Florida for duty, which he immediately obeyed, taking his family with him, not knowing until he reached Fort Myers on the Caloosahatchee River, 20 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, that hostilities were imminent between the U.S. troops and the Seminole Indians. He was the quartermaster, not a role that he was particularly fond of. He was much more a person that was hands-on in the action. But he was supplying the troops in the field, and this is a quote from Mrs. Hancock, but supplying the troops in the field under such perplexing circumstances was extremely difficult, unquestionably arduous, and involved serious and unaccustomed responsibilities. These, however, he overcame with apparent ease and entire satisfaction to each and every one in authority. And now we're going to go on to quote Mrs. Hancock. I would urge you to either buy a copy of her book from someplace like Amazon or eBay, or go on and read it online. She's very much a product of her time. She writes in Victorian era language. Her viewpoints are more typical viewpoints ultimately of people during that time. Just remember what time period she's in and how she writes. Our mail came from Tampa Bay in a sailboat, and wind and wave permitting was received once a week. And this is all verbatim from her book. Commissary stores and other supplies came in the same way. On occasion, when the boat capsized with a load of these stores, we were without some necessities of life for 6 weeks. Gail Borden was unknown then. And Borden, I think they're talking about the milk company. I know they made evaporated milk. And milk could only be obtained from the half-starved, miserable Florida cows. And I don't think she means the beef cattle. Fort Myers could not boast such an animal. And Mr. Hancock made 4 separate attempts before we could secure this luxury. Remember, they have a young child, and they'll actually go on to have another one while they're there. The first cow strayed from the herd during the overland journey and never reached us. The second came by sea, and while being landed at the dock, fell overboard and broke her neck. The third was safely landed, but wandered into quicksand on the day of her arrival, and so persistency was finally rewarded, and the 4th attempt was successful. Think about how hard it was to just get milk during that time period, and that's a rough sketch of the fort. It's from the Florida Memory Project. Such were, and this is more from Mrs. Hancock, and there's a picture of the fort, most likely during, they had the fort there than the Third Seminole War and the Civil War. Such were some of the inconveniences of our lives in Florida, yet I experienced much happiness in reflecting upon those days, since through my presence, my generous, hospitable husband was enabled to alleviate in many ways the suffering of the poor men and officers who were brought back from their hard and glorious service in the Everglades, which I'm sure it was very difficult, wounded by Indian bullets, or ill unto death with swamp fever. And that could be one of many illnesses, such as malaria, that they would catch because there were a number of insects there. Our bright, cheery homes became a rendezvous for officers who gladly acknowledged it to be an oasis in a desolate spot, and who frequently said that without this trysting place, they would have been driven to extremities in their search for diversion. How many times have I felt repaid for the deprivations endured there by the grateful assurances from some of the gentlemen who have never forgotten what a comfort our home was to them. When the troops were concentrating for service in the Everglades, they encamped about 1 mile from Fort Myers, and that's her spelling of Fort Myers, there not being sufficient quarters for either officers or men at the post. So although I thought it was very similar from the Third Seminole to the end of the Civil War when they reactivated it, perhaps it was enlarged a little bit, but there wasn't enough room for everybody, or there just wasn't enough room for everybody that was stationed there. During the rainy season, the storms were frequently so severe and so prolonged that no fires could be lighted or cooking be done in the camp. Pork for the men was cooked in the fort, while the officers fared as best as they could. During this time, I kept open house, and the table was always stretched to its full capacity. The officers drew lots for this privilege, and chance decided who would be our guest at breakfast, luncheon, and dinner. The probable or at least possible proximity of the Indians confined us closely to the post. And remember, I'm quoting Mrs. Hancock. These are not my words. Our constitutionals were limited to a long wharf projecting far out into the water. No other walks were permitted, and riding was out of the question. The river, however, afforded another diversion, and we often embarked onto the current of the stream in a well-manned barge, and with the oarsmen well armed. On several occasions, Indians were discovered on the bank, and by Mr. Hancock's direction, I, with my son Russell, would lie down in the bottom of the boat, in which position we were covered with the heavy rubber blanket. In one case, the amusing discovery was afterwards made that stalwart Indians in their flaming red blankets were nothing more but poor flamingos, innocent of any evil intent and occupied only with efforts to secure a dinner. We're going to be wrapping up her writing soon for this time period. And please forgive anything that seems totally inappropriate, because she is writing during that time period in her Victorian language, and also writing this book, not only to raise money for herself, but to make sure that her husband's reputation is maintained. And this is the blockhouse in the fort. And this is one of her final quotes. In this forsaken country, prodigal only in the number and variety of venomous snakes and insects of every kind, our sweet child Ada was born, sole daughter of our house and home. How proudly the father always spoke of her in his loving way, and how often he expressed his satisfaction that all things had gone well with us, and we had many inducements to make life worth living and painful to give up. 'Tis well the waiting shadows had not grown from out the gathering darkness. And that seems very flowery, but what happens is their daughter Ada is born there. It is a joyful moment for them. In fact, I didn't put it in here, but they supposedly plant a tree, which they come back and visit for a while. But sometime in the early 1900s, I believe, it was destroyed during a storm. But something will happen to their daughter as a fairly young woman. And that's what she's kind of foreshadowing there in her talk, in her writing, excuse me. Now back to me. And this is Mrs. Hancock, Almira Hancock, known as Myra most of the time, or Allie, about 1865, so at the end of the Civil War period. As operations wound down in Florida, Hancock was transferred to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he aided in combating partisan fighting during the Bleeding Kansas crisis. After a brief period in Utah, Hancock was stationed in Southern California in November 1858 and remained there until joined by Almira and the children, serving as a captain under future Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston. There, Hancock became friends with several officers from the South. He also became especially close to Lewis Armistead of Virginia, who he knew from their time at Fort Towson, Oklahoma in 1844 and 1845, and the Mexican-American War. Now here's another writing from Mrs. Hancock. I forgot I had more. And that is General Lewis Armistead. And I think I remember this story about his uniform that he sewed his own buttons back on. It wasn't quite the way it should look on an officer. He's about 7 years older, I believe, than Hancock, maybe about 46 at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, and Hancock will be about 39, but they're several years younger this time period. And here's Mrs. Hancock talking about it. It's with sadness I revert to those days of trial, when the hearts of some of our gallant officers were torn asunder by the conflicting passions of fidelity to their country and to their state, the sovereignty of which they were educated to believe superior to all other. They're talking about the men from the South. Full allowances must be made for the brave men of the South, who are as honest in their convictions as the bravest on the side of the Union. Many conferences were held in our home in Los Angeles between my husband and the Southern officers, who were urged by their relatives and friends to resign their commissions and offer their services to their own states, as otherwise they would be regarded as renegades through the South. They sought the advice of my husband, hoping to receive from him some comfort or encouragement, but he could give none. I would say to those dear friends, Armistead, Garnett, Pickett, and these are all well-known names from the Battle of Gettysburg, and a host of others whom he loved, I can give you no advice, as I shall not fight upon the principle of states' rights, but for the Union whole and undivided, as I do not and will not belong to a country formed of principalities. I cannot sympathize with you. You must be guided by your own convictions, and I hope you will make no mistakes. So basically he was saying, I'm not going to be loyal to my state. I'm going to be loyal to the Union. You're being loyal to your states, and I hope it goes well for you. You know, I don't think there's going to be a good resolution. Thus, drifting along, they hoped for a peaceful solution of the impending difficulties, but their fate was finally decided by the attempted separation of the southern states. Do I believe that she's quoting to the best of her ability? Yes. Do I believe these can be direct quotes? No. Do I believe that she has very fond memories of her time there with these gentlemen? Yes. And here we have Louis Armistead. Actually, that is the actor Richard Jordan portraying him as he would have looked in the Civil War. So this would have been 1860, 1861, 2 or 3 years earlier. And he looks somewhat like him. And this is Mrs. Hancock again talking. So I'm telling you, I'm going to be finishing up her writing, but then I have more. And there's more about Fort Myers. There's more about the war. Check it out. You can find it online. A never to be forgotten evening was spent at the home by the officers on the start upon their overland trip to the South. At 12 o'clock that night, General and Mrs. Johnston, and he will become well known in the Civil War on the Southern side. Before leaving, the general said to his wife, come sing to me 1 or 2 of the old songs you used to sing, Mary of Argyle and Kathleen Mavoureen. She complied reluctantly in the presence of such an audience, saying with deep emotion that she felt as though her music days were over. Those songs will ever be remembered by the survivors of that mournful gathering, the night they separate to go with the Union or to go with their loyalty to their home state in the South. Those songs will ever be remembered by the survivors of that mournful gathering. All were endeavoring to conceal under smiling exteriors hearts that were filled with sadness over the sundering of lifelong ties and doubts as to the result of their sacrifice. The most crushed of this party was Major Armistead, who with tears with his eyes, which were contagious, streaming down his face, and hands upon Mr. Hancock's shoulder, while looking him steadily in the eye, said, Hancock, goodbye. You could never know what this has cost me, and I hope God will strike me dead if I'm ever induced to leave my native soil, which was Virginia, should worse come to worse. Turning to me, he placed a small satchel in my hand, requesting that it should not be opened except in the event of his death, in which case the souvenirs it contained, with the exceptions of a little prayer book intended for me, and which I still possess, should be sent to his family. On the flyleaf of this book is the following: Louis A. Armistead, trust in God and fear nothing. At the same time, he presented to Mr. Hancock with a new major's uniform, saying that he might sometime need it. This particular promotion never came to him, as he jumped the grades from captain to brigadier general. Armistead died in the way that he prayed for. I, as well as my husband, believe that he courted death that finally came to him at Gettysburg, for I have often heard how bravely he came to the front of his brigade, waving his sword, and how he was shot through the body and fell within our lines. That is true. He makes it to the Union lines, putting his hand on cannon, asking to be taken to the Hancock's tent. At the same moment, my husband had fallen with what was supposed at the time a mortal wound. 3 out of 6 from who we had parted on that evening in Los Angeles were killed in front of General Hancock's troops, and others wounded. And one of the complaints about Mrs. Hancock is that they don't know who the other people are that she's talking about. And yes, she writes in the language of the time, and it's quite flowery and quite detailed. I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about Louis Armistead. He went to the West Point. He had got racked up a lot of demerits, came back, started over again, was back there again, got into dispute with another Southern general, Jubal Early, hit him over the head with the plate, and was expelled from West Point, but was from a military family, was able to join up. And eventually some tragedy befalls him. He loses a wife, He loses a child. He loses a second wife. And Richard Jordan, as he's playing the role of Hancock, by the way, knows he's dying. The actor knows he's dying. I'll talk about that a little more, but keep that in mind. He's gone through a lot of tragedy. He has one child left and a stepdaughter left. And also, he's from a military family. His uncle commanded the fort at Fort McHenry. His last name is also Armistead. Let's jump back to my narrative about Hancock's Civil War time. He's stationed in Los Angeles, and they were trying to keep the Union ammunition from Southern sympathizers, of which there were many. And Los Angeles only had about 5,000 people then. He was assigned to be General Anderson's quartermaster in Kentucky. Thankfully for the Union, General McClellan, the commanding general, recognized Hancock's potential. He would go on to become commanding general and made him a brigadier general. On May 5th, 1862, Hancock took the initiative at the Battle of Williamsburg and occupied 2 abandoned redoubts. Despite a Union loss, Hancock's reputation skyrocketed because of this battle. After the battle, General George McClellan writes to his wife, "Hancock was superb today." Superb stuck with him throughout the war. During the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, Hancock was ordered to command mortally wounded General Israel Richardson's division at the Sunken Road. In November, he's promoted to Major General. At Chancellorsville, which is just a couple of months before the Battle of Gettysburg, his division was the last on the field, holding on long enough for the Federals to withdraw. General Darius Couch, commander of the Second Corps, had been upset with the performance of Fighting Joe Hooker. Couch left the Corps, and Hancock becomes its new commander. And that's a painting by the Civil War artist Dale Gallen, and a pretty accurate depiction of Hancock. And this is day 1. It's a 3-day battle at Gettysburg, and you can see this monument located at East Cemetery Hill. And if you are interested in the Civil War and you ever get a chance to visit any battlefields, seize them, particularly, in my opinion, the Battle of Gettysburg. It speaks to me. I think I can feel the spirits of the men and the women who were there. Here's a statue of General Hancock. He was a newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade, brand spanking new, sent for Hancock from his command post in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, to join him immediately. Word had reached Meade that 2 Federal corps, the 1st and the 9th, were engaged near Gettysburg. The 1st Corps commander and close friend of both men, Major General John Fulton Reynolds, had been killed about 4 p.m. And by the way, he was offered the command that George Meade had if he had accepted it. Of course, he didn't know this. He didn't want that. Very political position. He probably would not have died that day. It was a huge loss for the Union. General Hancock arrived to examine the situation, and he goes in an ambulance carriage part of the way there so he can look at the maps, view the ground, not because he's lazy, but to know what's going on. And he arrives to examine the situation and to decide whether to drop back to where they were supposed to be, about 15 miles southeast at Pike Creek, or if this was a good ground to fight on, since the troops had already been engaged. Hancock studied the terrain and reported that Gettysburg was the place to fight. And I'll tell you, there was some drama because somebody else, a general from Maine, was at command at the time, and then Hancock comes in and takes over. And so there's a little drama there, but we don't know what was said, and Hancock does command until Meade arrives there that evening. This is interesting. This is a quote from the great historian that is at Gettysburg. Talks about Gettysburg quite a bit, writes a number of books about all types of battles, some that are overlooked, and was the head historian for the National Park Service. And this is what he says about Hancock in one of his books. He says, Hancock uses profanity, and his name is Ed Bars, by the way, who I'm quoting, profanity like an artist uses oils. but he still looks every bit the part of a soldier. This is important for you to know that he has these leadership qualities. It's said that men feel confident when they are around him, and this will be very important on the afternoon of July 1st at Cemetery Hill, and again on July 2nd and 3rd at Cemetery Ridge. At the age of 39, Hancock is losing the Battle of the Bulge, so he always wears a long frock coat. His other trademark is the ever-present clean starch white shirt. And you're going to say, looking a little different. Well, this is from the movie Gettysburg, and I think the actor did a good job. And I looked to try to find his height, because Hancock is 6'2", and he's an imposing figure and just seems to be a person that the soldiers would follow in battle. This gentleman, and I think, as I said, did a good job, but he's not a focal point of the movie, not as much as Armistead, and he appears much smaller when you compare him to the other men on the field. Just as an aside point, but that's a picture of him. Here's Hancock directing the troops. And this is a controversial thing. Union General Sickles advanced his men without a permission, half a mile from his original position, creating a gap in the Union lines. Cemetery Ridge was now vulnerable, and Confederate forces poured in the half mile wide opening that left a huge gap. Union General Hancock had sent for reinforcements upon seeing that, and now he can't go back. Once Sickles has moved, there's no going back. But these enforcements wouldn't arrive for 5 minutes. All he had to plug the gap stood before him. He looked at the regiment and said, "My God, are these all the men we have? What regiment is this?" Hancock asked. "The 1st Minnesota," commanding officer William Colville replied. "Charge those lines," ordered Hancock. They had 262 men, down from 1,000 men, which was what typical regiment at the start of the war. Hancock needed 5 minutes. They gave him 15. The 1st Minnesota, and there's all kinds of figures tossing around. I went with the 6-1, it could be 4-1, it could be 8-1, but they were outnumbered. Well, think about that number, 262 men. There were 215 casualties that day. Those men went in, they've already lost so much, and they go into that battle knowing that it's most likely certain death, or at least severe injury. No soldiers on any field in this or any other country ever displayed grander heroism. And this is Minnesota Forward by Dale Gallen. So Hancock, of course, mourned the death of the men, but he said he would do it again, even if he had to lose all of them, because what would have happened is that it could have rolled up the line all the way perhaps to the round tops, and perhaps the outcome of the battle. There's a lot of perhaps and ifs, and I can't predict. But are those men heroes? Yes. And are there monuments to them? Yes. But it was a huge loss, and I don't think they deserve the credit that they should get. And Hancock made the very hard decisions. I don't know if I could have done that. This is Hancock on day 3. This is called Hancocks Ride by Dale Gallen. I realize battles are fought a little different then, and you're going to be a target on horseback. Here he is. This is before Prickett's charge, the famous charge where the Southern troops are going to walk across a field into a hail of lead from cannons and artillery, just everything, weapons that are there. It's about a mile across, again by Dale Gallen. It says, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock rides the federal line preceding Pickett's charge. When an officer urged the general to take shelter, he responded, "There are times when a corps commander's life does not count." And that was his philosophy. By July 1st to 3rd, 1863, George Meade was the commander. And that's just a review of what he does there on those days. But during that battle, On day 3, his men helped to halt Pickett's charge. They're coming across that field. Hancock was seriously wounded in the thigh during the battle. And the picture, do you remember seeing that picture? He is on horseback. Although wood and a nail from the saddle were removed from the wound, Hancock spent months in excruciating pain while doctors attempted to remove the mini ball. They couldn't get it out. I should have brought a mini ball. It's kind of cone shaped and it has rifling, spiraling on the end, and it would flatten out when it went into your body. It would do a lot of damage. So he was on, parts of his saddle go in there, they get those out. And finally, he had sent a telegram to Myra, and finally they send him to his father's home in Norristown, Pennsylvania. And this Dr. Lewis Reed, who I really wasn't able to find a lot about, he was able to successfully remove the ball by recreating the general's position in the saddle. And some people think they put him on a sawhorse. Some people think they had him sit on a chair with a saddle. Nobody really knows how it was done. But thankfully, finally, they get the mini ball out because I think he was dying. I mean, his family is there. But he is never going to be the same. A lot of these wounds affect the men for the rest of their life. He's never going to be the same. He has pieces of bone, I didn't put that on there, that come out of the wound very later on. And by the way, a joint resolution of Congress was passed on January 28, 1864, thanking Meade, Hooker, and Howard. And that was General Howard that Hooker spoke with, that general from Maine I told you about, for their roles at Gettysburg. And Hancock's name wasn't absent. And I truly believe he was one of the heroes of the battle, leading his men right near where he needed to be in the front. And this is a picture of him from his book, published in the 1880s called The Life of Hancock. And there he is. They're getting ready to take him to a field hospital. And here's Richard Jordan in the movie Gettysburg, leading his men at Pickett's charge. On the 3rd day of the battle, Armistead led his brigade during Pickett's charge, reportedly urging his men to remember that you are fighting for your homes, your friends, your sweethearts. And I'm just going to stop briefly here because in the book, Killer Angels, which leads to the book, movie Gettysburg, he said, he was asking about Winfield Scott Hancock. And he talks about that evening in the movie that Mrs. Hancock talked about. And he knows, here's Armistead going across the field, his best friend, his dear friend, according to his, Mrs. Hancock was across the field. He was definitely standing there. And he said, talks about that evening in California, he said, and remember, this is fiction, an author saying some of the words that are fiction. He said, toward the end of the evening, it got rough. We all began, well, you know, there were a lot of tears. Armistead's voice wavered, took a deep breath. Well, I was crying and I went up to Win and I took him by the shoulder and I said, Win, so help me. If I ever lift a hand to you, may God strike me dead. Longstreet, his commanding general, felt a cold shudder. He looked down at the ground. There's nothing to say. Armistead said, shaken, I've not seen him since. I haven't been on the field with him. Thank God. It troubles me to think on it. And I could go on and on with parts from this book. I would recommend it is fiction, but there are words that Mrs. Hancock had used in that. So he said he fixes his hat on his sword, raises it, and he walks across the field where, according to James McPherson, he's leading a handful of men. Most of them have fallen, realizing they're going into a hail of lead. He said, Armistead was mortally wounded with his hand on a Yankee cannon, and his followers fell like leaves in the autumn wind. The spot where Armistead and his men fell, a bend in the wall that became known as the angle, is known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead was taken to a field hospital where he requested his watch and other valuables be given to his friend Hancock, who was across from him that day, the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge. Armistead died 2 days later on July 5th and was buried in his family plot in St. Paul's Churchyard in Baltimore. So he's buried with his uncle, the commander from Fort McHenry. He does ask to see the general and does find out actually that the general has also been shot, which has greatly distressed him. And this is Union General Winfield Scott Hancock and Confederate General Lewis Armistead were personal friends and members of the Masonic fraternity, because you can't see the writing there. But this is from part of the plaque at this monument. It's up near the entrance to the annex to the National Cemetery. And it's called Friend to Friend, Brotherhood Undivided. It was placed there by the Masons. It's done by the Civil War sculptor Ron Tunison, who had since passed away. And this is just some of the writing on it. Depicted in this sculpture is Union Captain Henry Bigham, a Mason and staff assistant to General Hancock, himself wounded, rendering aid to the fallen general, Armistead. And Armistead is shown handing his watch and personal effects to be taken to his friend, Union General Hancock. Hancock survives the war and died in 1886. Armistead died at Gettysburg, July 5th, 1863. Captain Bingham, who attained the rank of the general and later served 32 years in the United States House of Representatives. He was known as Father of the House. And he's fallen, and then he's taken back a little bit into the Union lines, but still laying there right near the field. And that's when Captain Bingham comes upon him. And supposedly Armistead gives the Masonic cry of distress. And I mean, I've seen things that depict a physical gesture, but it's believed he says something, I'm going to say this, not exact, but something to the effect of, can anyone help a poor widow's son? And that's was supposed to render aid. And even in the battle, even at that time, it's an enemy soldier, Bingham, who was on Hancock's staff, comes over to him and provides comfort. It gets him back to a hospital. This is the monument to where Hancock is wounded on the south of Gettysburg on the west side of Hancock Avenue. If you're going to go there, get a book about the monuments, you can visit them. If there are any ranger talks, go to them. And if you can, hire a battlefield guide and tell them what you're interested in. They can do a general overview or they can be specific. And here's the monument to inside the angle near the copse of trees near Hancock Avenue. It's not exactly in the right place. I believe it's a few feet over, but you get the idea. He got very far into the Union lines. And this is the same setting that I'm in front of, and I'm kind of blocking, but behind me is General Hancock and his full staff. And this is at the Battle of the Wilderness. And here's Hancock surrounded by three of his division commanders, Barlow, Birney, and Gibbon during the Wilderness campaign. And he's the man right down here that's sitting down. He's going to return quite a while later in March of 1864, where he performed with distinction at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. But complications from his Gettysburg wound, pieces of bone would come out of it, forced him to leave the field in November of 1864. After watching his Second Corps suffer more than 40,000 casualties during the Overland Campaign, those were some particularly brutal battles. He assumed departmental command and position he held till the war's end, so he wasn't able to be on the field where his heart was. After the assassination of Lincoln, he is put in a very difficult position, and he receives criticism for his role in the execution of Mary Surratt. All those Lincoln conspirators were tried by military tribunal, and she was one of the alleged conspirators. He didn't want her to be executed. He also, but he had to follow his orders. That did not do great things for his reputation then. And he also received criticism while he was commander of the 5th Military District during Reconstruction. He had issued General Orders number 40 and declared a state of peace existed in the district, so it would not interfere with civil authorities. That meant there was no military there. But he didn't think that that was the best thing to do. And when Grant was inaugurated as the 18th president, Hancock was sent to the Department of Dakota. In November of 1872, Hancock became the new general of the Division of the Atlantic, a position he held the rest of his life. Just a couple of things, I'll wrap up his story, but I would urge you to, there's many books, not many as he deserves, and not one in recent memory about him. I think he's an underrated general for the Civil War. This is his daughter, Ada, and a newspaper clipping. She's only 18 years old. The funeral of the late Ada Hancock took place yesterday afternoon from the residence of her father. The remains were taken to church configuration, and she dies at 18, and she will end up being buried in the same place as her father is in Norristown. Briefly, let's talk about what Hancock does after he's not in active military duty on the field. Hancock won the 1880 Democratic Party nomination, and his supporters campaigned across the country, hoping to soundly defeat Republican candidate James Garfield. The campaign was exhausting at a time with both Almira and Winfield wanted privacy. Their grandson had died on the day Winfield received the nomination, adding to the grief from their daughter's death several days before. And a few years later, then his son dies. So these people have experienced tragedy and grief. Winfield Scott Hancock did not win the presidential election. On the election night, he went to bed early while Almira stayed up waiting for the results. And this is quoting Mrs. Hancock. At 5 o'clock on the following morning, he inquired of me of the news. I replied, "It's been a complete Waterloo for you." "That is all right," he said, "I can stand it." And in another moment, he was again asleep. And this is an illustration from the life of Hancock, published in the 1880s. And I'm going to assume this is them. Mr. and Mrs. Hancock is more mature people, and their children as grown adults, and then their children as they would have been when they were young. After Winfield read, edited, and commented. And by the way, he only loses that election by about 8,000 votes. So the popular vote, he did very well. But in the Electoral College, it was a clear victory for Garfield. And by the way, Garfield will go on to become assassinated. He read and commented on various histories of the Civil War. Close family members, including Russell, passed away. He coordinates Ulysses S. Grant's funeral. Friends and Civil War veterans often called at the Hancock home frequently to visit and reminisce about the past. At the beginning of 1886, Winfield began to have serious health issues. In early February, he became feverish and lapsed into delirium. On February 9th, Winfield struggled to say, "Oh, Allie, Allie, Myra." He murmured, "Good," and unable to finish his words, Winfield lapsed into unconsciousness and died quietly several hours later. I believe he was about 62 years old. He had also developed severe diabetes, and he always suffered from his wound. And we don't know the date of this picture of Almira Hancock, but it was in later years. And he's always been a soldier, didn't receive a great amount of pay, and they had lived on a soldier's salary, and they always had to pay for their expenses while they did entertaining, and they did a lot, and pay for their housing. And they'd had little money set aside, so Almira had no surviving children to help. And Union veterans heard that Almira was in need, mostly men from his corps, but I'm sure there were others as well. And they rallied to her aid, raising $55,000, which is a lot of money at that time, and giving her a home in Washington City, which actually was a part of DC. That there's no Washington City today, but there was then. And in 1887, Almira's book, Reminiscences of Winfield Scott Hancock was published. And you'll also see an abridged version, I think, called Hancock the Superb. But as I said, you can buy a reprint or you can find it online and read it. And truly, it is Victorian era language. She tells the story of the general's life. Some people question some of her memories. Of course, it was written later, but I think the intent, of course, it's to boost her husband's memory. But I think she probably remembered the best she could, and I would say probably most of it is pretty accurate. She lived in Washington, moved to Europe for a year, and then resided in New York. When Almira Russell Hancock died on April 20th, 1893, she was buried in St. Louis. I have no answer as to why she's not buried with her husband, but that was her home. And I couldn't find out where their son Russell was buried. If I did more research, maybe I could, but I would guess it's in Mississippi. If not, maybe near his mother. And this is where Almira is buried in St. Louis. I haven't been there. That was on Find a Grave. And here, I've never been to Hancock's, where he's entombed. His daughter is there with him. There's been a couple times when there was great upset because it was not well maintained, and Norristown, I think, was a little bit of a rough area, and my husband Dwayne told me a lot of damage had been done to this. Supposedly it's now being kept in good condition because it was a disgrace for quite a while. Sometimes there are troops that go out there to pay tribute to him. I don't know how recently that's happened, but Hancock and his daughter are there. They did have 2 grandsons and a granddaughter that survived. So there are Hancock descendants. I do not know where they are today. I'll recommend a couple things. I'm going to put this over my face so you can see it, and you probably can't see it. This is Killer Angels. Let me sneak it up here. It's a great book. You probably can get it from your local library. Yes, it's historic fiction. Yes, there's some things I don't like about it, but most of all, it won a Pulitzer Prize. It brings attention to a lot of people and makes them to care about a war that determined a lot about our country. And it's the movie Gettysburg. Some people call it the movie of the bad beards, but you know what? And there's some fiction, like when Armistead is dying, they bring Joshua Chamberlain's brother Tom on the field instead of Bingham. But those are small things. I think you get the spirit. Watch it if you get a chance. And here we go. Louis Armistead. The only thing written about him is this. And this is a booklet, and it's not even in print anymore, and it's called Trust in God and Fear Nothing. And that is written on the flyleaf of what he gives to Mrs. Hancock. You might be able to find it on eBay. It's written by the man that's head of the Gettysburg Foundation. Well worth reading the story of Louis Armistead. He's a very I think he was sentimental about his friend. I think he's a little more emotionally portrayed in the movie, but because at times he's a tough soldier and he had been through a lot. Anyway, if you're interested, try to find that. That's the only book about him. I'm going to wrap this up pretty quick. I've been talking for a very long time, and next week we'll see if we can get the slideshow next month to act a little better so I can just have that in full screen. But here are some sources. There's a site called Emerging Civil War. They have 2 articles about Mrs. Hancock. Battlefields.org. I should have put that in there. The American Battlefield Association has great stuff. Join it. Women History Blog, Pennsylvania Things, Florida Memory Project, the Seminole Nation Museum website, and some books. Mrs. Hancock's book, The Reminiscences, Hancock at Gettysburg and Beyond. I got to hear this author speak. Receding Tide by Ed Bars. What a man. I spelled his name wrong there, but you get, this should be 2 R's, but amazing, knowledgeable man. And that booklet, Trust in God and Fear Nothing. And then, of course, Killer Angels. So next month, the digital discussion, the Battle of Fort Myers, September 14th, 2021, 10:30 a.m. more of a skirmish, but I think it's significant. There really is nothing left of it today, but let's try to recreate it together. I wish there was something here. If you ever wish to send any correspondence, donate money, there's our address. All of the digital discussions I've done, and I thank you for putting up with my mistakes. You can find them on YouTube if you put in Edison Ford Winter State's YouTube channel, or and make sure you click on full playlist when you get there, because you can see not all of them could we put up there, but 5 of them that Adam did, who did them before me, are there, and all of the ones that I have done. And there's my email. If you have comments, questions, suggestions, I welcome them. I'll go up here to the chat and hopefully I won't do anything goofy. With your knowledge of Civil War, and I didn't see the rest of the question, but thanks, Dan. Does anybody have any questions before I go? Comments? Well, I thank you all for joining. Oh, here we go. With your knowledge of Civil War history, I was looking forward to this presentation, and it more than lived up to my expectations. Thank you very much. And I did want to highlight his time here in Fort Myers. I wish there were other things other than Mrs. Hancock's, though I'm grateful she was here, but that is the only source that's available about that time period. Lots more information about the Civil War, though she is the only one that also writes about that time out in California. I urge you to do further exploration and just enjoy history. I'm going to keep on doing these as long as people show up and listen to them, and there's a need. I thank you for coming. That's it for today, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Great research. Killer Angel's a favorite of mine too. I'm glad you read it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. And thank you so much. So wonderful info. I hope they continue. I'll do it as long as you're watching. Thanks. I'll sign off for now, and I thank you all. Bye-bye.